You are listening to Chthonia, the podcast of the Dark Feminine. Chthonia's logo was designed by J.R. Malpair. Background music is Phantasm by Kevin MacLeod. Hello, and welcome to Chthonia. My name is Breach Burke, and I'm your host for these episodes. This week, I would like to take a little bit of a turn back to ancient Greece, and the subject of this week's talk is going to be Kirke, sometimes pronounced in sort of our Western parlance as Circe. And she is considered to be a goddess of, she's primarily associated with witchcraft. The main story that we know of her comes from the Odyssey, in which she turns Odysseus' men into pigs. And she is considered to be the daughter of, she's the daughter of the sun god Helios, and her mother is Circe, who is one of the Oceanids. The Oceanids are nymphs that were born of the Titans Oceanus and Tethys, who are the original sort of, one sort of has to do with fresh water, one with salt water, sort of the original Titans of the great seas. And their children were the Oceanids, and the Oceanids were about 3,000 of these nymphs, water spirits, water elementals, really. So she is the child of a water elemental and the sun god Helios, and in some versions she's the daughter of the goddess Hecate, which is not entirely, given her role as an enchantress, and as somebody who guides the way through the dark. Her association with Hecate is not entirely, the idea of her, some versions of her being a child of Hecate is not that strange. Now, there's a number of stories about her. I think that, and again, the main one is the one that we see in the Odyssey, in which case when Odysseus and his men end up in their travels, they're leaving Troy, and they've stopped at all these different islands along the way. By this time, they've gone to the island of the Lotus Eaters, which I'm going to talk about again in a minute, because I feel like it has a little bit of there's at least some kind of a comparison point here with what happens later, which is where some of his men eat the lotus flowers, and then they sort of fall into a state of forgetfulness. And so he pulls the rest of his men away before he loses any more of them, because they just basically just want to sit around and not do anything after doing that. They go to the island of Polyphemus, where he has to outwit Polyphemus to keep him from killing and eating all of his men, Polyphemus being a cyclops. And he manages to outwit him, but then he very stupidly tells Polyphemus who he is as he's leaving, and Polyphemus' father is Poseidon, the god of the sea. So, of course, he calls upon his father to avenge him, and, when you're on a vessel headed for home on the sea, you really don't want to anger the god of the sea. So, Odysseus kind of ends up being bounced around quite a bit. They go to the island of the Lastrygonians, who are cannibals. So he's not having a very good run of luck. And then he comes to Kirke's island. And initially, he doesn't go on the boat. His men kind of go to scout things out. And when they get there, she sees them, she welcomes them, she offers them feasting and food and drink. But there's Eurylochus, one of Odysseus' men. He sort of is suspicious of this whole setup. There's something about it. I think the terminology used was overly peaceful facade. That there's something about it, it's almost too good to be true. There's something about it that doesn't quite seem right. And what happens is that as soon as the men drink this particular concoction she has of wine and certain herbs, they become turned into pigs. Okay, so in all of the different stories about Kirke, she turns men into animals of some kind. Or of something, or even if it's not, former lovers or men, she's surrounded by primeval animals in some versions, related to the Argonautica in particular. So the connection between Kirke and sort of wild animals, or the animals, is very, I feel it's very significant. Okay. Now, of course, what ends up happening is Eurylochus manages to go back to the ship, tell Odysseus what's going on, and when he goes to try to negotiate and find out what's happening, he's stopped by the god Hermes. Who was also thought of in the Roman as Mercury, if that's a little more, probably a lot of people listening to this podcast know the Hermes-Mercury thing. In case you don't, they're the same deity. But Hermes, who comes as a messenger of Athena, because Athena is the one who looks after Odysseus. She's sort of the feminine warrior figure who looks after Odysseus. And Athena comes to him and she says, Hermes comes to him and says to him, don't approach her directly. He gives him a plant. And the plant is described very interesting fashion. It is called moly, M-O-L-Y. And the way that Homer describes it is he says, the root is black while the flower was white as milk. The gods call it moly, dangerous for a mortal man to pluck from the soil, but not for the deathless god. All lies within their power. Okay, now what's interesting about this, okay, you think about it, it's black at the root, but white as snow at the top. So there's almost a metaphor there for the sort of the fearful side of the feminine. It looks white as milk, it looks pure, it looks beautiful, it's aesthetically pleasing at the top, but the root is dark. Okay, so just think about that. And then of course, if you've heard the expression "holy moly," you now know that it's referring to this plant, and the whole idea was that this was just some kind of a sacred plant. It was very the fact that it was dangerous for mortals to pick suggests that there's something about it connected with death and mortality. Because the gods can pick it very easily, and of course they're the ones who give it to Odysseus, and he is able to thwart Kirke's spells in that way. And then Kirke instead switches tactics, and she becomes an ally. She seduces him, she takes him to bed, she changes all his men back. But one of the things that she has to do in this process is that she has to, one of the things Hermes says is she's still very dangerous. You have to make her swear an oath on all the names of the gods that she's not going to take your manhood, okay? Now, another very interesting theme, what does it mean to take one's manhood? Well, there's certainly the image of castration, if we want to get very Freudian about this. And really one of the root fears of the feminine, when we think about the devouring, or back to the vagina dentata or something like that, the idea of the feminine as devouring or emasculating, okay? So, all right, so we're already seeing these kinds of associations with her. Somebody, pretty on the outside, dark and dangerous, perhaps at the root, when we, see the symbolism of the plant, and then also the symbolism of, these other things that she, these other kinds of associations with her, and this is sort of the archetype of this temptress figure, which is actually what Jung would refer to as the Anima. Now the Anima is considered to be, again, Jung never really perfectly defines what the Anima is or what it means, and part of that he explains in his writing is that because the archetypes themselves can never really be known. You can't pin them down to a label or a definition. You just kind of know them when you see them. And Kirke is sort of embodies the qualities of what we think of as the Anima archetype, because she's magical, okay? And if you think about a lot of folk tales, one of the motifs in folk tales is that you frequently have the woman who is... I don't want to put it, that there's somebody's going out on a journey, there's some kind of a crisis, whether they're sent out on the journey or whether they, willingly go on a quest. There is some kind of magical female who helps them, and this is the Anima figure. Now, the Anima is the feminine that's encountered by the masculine in a sort of hero mythology kind of construct, which is actually quite, I'm going to say somewhat... patriarchal in its leanings, just in its implications anyway, and in its values. The feminine is a dangerous force to be, I think the way Jung describes it is she injects her poison right off. If we think about what we said about Medusa and the stinging, the idea of these tentacled monsters as Medusas. It's the idea of the sort of poisonous feminine. The feminine, and what the poison does is it takes away a man's sense of control. It may take away his sense of reason. And that's where the emasculation part would come in. Not so much that there's literal emasculation, but more that the woman is now the one in control. Because the woman is powerful. Her beauty is powerful. Her abilities make her powerful. And so therefore the man feels threatened, and the general response that we have seen in psychology and mythology is that the man, needs to take some kind of an action to, subdue that force, or to tame it. Which can also happen if the other person falls in love with them. I mean, that can go both ways when a woman is sort of possessed by the animus. The animus has a whole different dynamic to it. It was described once as more like a crowd of men moving in on a woman and judging her, rather than a single image per se. But I might want to save that discussion for another time. But that has been another one of the discussion, the difference between the anima and the animus. But Jung also felt that the anima was terribly important because not only is it sort of archetype that teaches men how to love, and not just sexual love or lust, but that can lead one, perhaps through those paths to real love, to genuine love that's not, not that sexuality and those things aren't important, but that, as anybody who's been in a long-term relationship knows, those are not the only things. Those are not the things that necessarily last, okay? That's an aspect of things that may or may not always be there, okay? So this is more about, it's sort of a gateway not only to love, but also to creativity, because the anima acts as a kind of a muse figure. They behave in such a way that that inspires the man, that takes the man outside of whatever his own ego, his own personality or persona, his apparent nature. That's why when there's such a very strong rejection of the feminine by men, it often leads to a feeling of powerlessness, because really within the anima lies the power. Okay? Now, in the case of Odysseus, what he does is he manages to sort of, beat her at her own game with the magic, but through the help of Hermaeus, mind you. It's not something he would have known to do on his own. He also needed a magical helper in the form of this sort of liminal god who can cross over between categories. And so he, of course, they said to pretend to threaten her with his sword. Now remember, this is almost like a game or a ritual that's played, and in the end, in other words, in the end, there's no real malice, there's no real intent to harm, but there's, but it's a way of trying to get Kirke to, not that he's going to try to, make her his slave, although it has been argued that, okay, so now she's gone from being this goddess to being this enchantress to now being like the domestic, the one who cooks and cleans for Odysseus and his men. So, there is kind of that social inflection that, social ethical inflection that's there, and that's certainly worth thinking about in terms of, what I feel though is I tend to look at it more on the mythological or the archetypal level, where those particular categories of social classes and roles and categories don't matter because it's not really talking about that. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that they can't influence the narratives that we have, or the way that we see ourselves, or the way that we see the roles of men and women in society, and the way that we react when we see people who don't fit neatly into those categories. The people who are transgender, for example, who aren't neatly into the male or female role. It's not it's something that's come to light, and I just feel, not to digress too much on this point, but I feel part of it is just to show, these there may be something in the archetypal mythology, but that doesn't have to translate to the social level. Okay, it doesn't have to translate to what your role is in life. It's not, one does not necessarily inform the other. Okay, so in other words, the anima is not all women. The animus is not all men. Okay, strictly speaking, they are the souls of the opposite. The animus is in the woman. The anima is in the man. It's that feminine part of a man, the masculine part of a woman. But those, there's no mutually exclusive categories. I mean, there's maybe biological differences, but there's no, I think on the social level, you can't make these very strict delineations. So anyway, I feel like I'm getting too far off on that. I don't want to do that. There are some other stories of Kirke, okay? Now, also in the Odyssey, she is the one who helps Odysseus practice the rite of necromancy, in which he raises the spirit of Tiresias, and he ends up talking to many other spirits, including those of warriors like Achilles who have passed, his own mother, different people who he's seen, who he sees in the underworld who come to drink of the blood of the sacrifice and to speak. But it's Tiresias is the one he wants to speak to because this is Kirke's way of helping him. You must go into the underworld to find the way home. And of course, as one of my teachers had pointed out, because you never really can go home again. He will go back to Ithaca. It will not be the same Ithaca that he left. And he will not be the same, okay? So his underworld journey, his katabasis, his need to pass through the darkness, through the belly of the whale, as it were, is mediated by Kirke. Now, that is literally the role of the anima. I mean, that is what the anima does. It's that that's why Hecate is such an important figure in that respect. She, when you're going through the darkness of the underworld, she holds the torch ahead of her so that you can see where you're going. Okay. but it's, but there's others. Hesiod's Theogony, he talks about, he claims that Kirke bore Odysseus 3 sons, Ardius, Latinus, and Telegonus. There is actually what they call part of the epic cycle, some Trojan War, like post-Trojan War accounts, either during the war or post-war, end of the war, covering territory that the Iliad and the Odyssey, well, the Iliad in particular, does not necessarily cover in terms of the war, or that the Odyssey covers in terms of the post-war. And so the Teleogony is, it seems like there might be a couple different versions of it, but we only have the notes about it, it's one of those things where it's mentioned, but we don't have the full story. In the Teleogony, Kirke, Telegonus, the one son, Kirke tells him that Odysseus is his father. He goes to search for his father, but he goes with a poisoned spear. And then he ends up running into his father in his search, unknowingly kills him. He brings the father's corpse back to her island, along with Penelope and Telemachus, the other son. And in some versions, there are marriages. I'm trying to think who married. Telemachus marries Kirke. I don't know. There's some different. I'm trying to remember what the matchups were there. But in those cases, it's kind of a very weird ending if you see how the Odyssey ends. This idea of Penelope and Telemachus going to Kirke's island. And that supposedly Kirke made all of them immortal. But in other versions, I think Telemachus eventually kills Kirke, and then Odysseus kills himself. There's all kinds of these other narratives, but these are all kind of based on the idea that she did actually have that Odysseus fathered 3 children by Kirke. Okay, and in some versions, by the way, these are founders of Italian cities. Telegonus, in particular, was considered to be the founder of the Etruscans, and the Etruscans are at least one group of people who act as the predecessors to what we think of as the Romans. Okay, so very interesting. Rome, of course, picks Aeneas to be their hero and to head their epic, rather than the Greek side, rather than having Odysseus or Kirke or that kind of be part of their heritage. But in some versions, that remakes that Greek connection. I think the Romans purposely wanted to, certainly Virgil was trying to stay away from the Greek, suggesting that Roman civilization came out of Greek, which actually many aspects of it did. There was that sort of, the term they use is translatio studii. It's a transfer of knowledge, usually from east to west. And so you see the knowledge of the Far East come to what we think of as the Mesopotamian region, and then Greece, and then those areas, and then moving farther west to Rome and to Italy, and then eventually to Europe, and then eventually to the Americas. I mean, that's at least one sort of theoretical, historical, historiographical way of looking at things. Okay, so but the Romans, because they were there had been war, and they were kind of establishing themselves as establishing their greatness, the greatness of their lineage. They Virgil opted to make that lineage related to the heroes and the demigods related to Troy rather than to Greece. Okay, so that so perhaps that is one of the reasons that this epic, the Teleogony, kind of faded off as kind of a side story rather than the one that we tend to know, because that was not the official narrative of Rome. So there's these children. Another thing about Kirke is she has a niece, and her niece is the goddess is Medea, the one who is part of the central figure of the Argonautica. Euripides has a play about her. She is the one who falls in love with Jason when he comes to Colchis to claim the Golden Fleece. She is the one who actually gets the Golden Fleece for him, or she puts the dragon to sleep so that he can go steal the fleece. But then they end up murdering her brother, and Kirke has to come along and purify them, because that's always part of it was. If you killed someone, you had to go to an oracle or to a king or to somebody with authority who could provide purification rituals for your crime. And Kirke, she performed the rituals for them, but she basically said, "I don't really absolve you of this crime." Okay, because she is among Kirke's other relations. Aeetes, who's the king of Colchis, the one that Jason stole the fleece from, is in fact her brother. And Pasiphae is also her sister, the wife of King Minos and the mother of the Minotaur. Okay, so she's got, there's a lot of these very strange or very dark or mysterious feminine connections when we talk about Kirke, seemingly regardless of the mythology. Now, later on in the Roman period, you do see, she is mentioned in the Aeneid, when Aeneas, of course, avoids Kirke's island. Okay, he does not go there. He manages to avoid it because she, again, is seen as somebody with all these, the souls of men who were turned into animals. I mean, that theme is still played out. And Ovid's Metamorphosis mentions a story of Kirke where she, of course, in the Roman, Odysseus is known as Ulysses, so they do talk about that encounter. But the story of interest here has to do with Scylla and Charybdis. Scylla was a beautiful nymph, also, and she was, and there was a sea god called Glaucus, or sort of a sea spirit, and he was in love with Scylla. So what he did was he went to Kirke and asked to get a love potion to make Scylla fall in love with him. Well, Kirke fell in love with Glaucus and wanted to seduce him, but he was not interested. He was interested in Scylla. So, in her jealous rage, Kirke went and poisoned the waters where Scylla bathed every day. And so when she went to bathe, she was turned into this hideous monster, with, baying wolves, heads and, multiple heads and, this sort of monstrous serpent-like body. And Scylla is one of those, is often put together with Charybdis, who's basically a monstrous interpretation of a giant whirlpool. And both of these were said to be, I'm trying to remember which strait they were said to be part of initially. I think I've kind of forgotten it because more evidence tends to show that what's actually called the Strait of Scylla, down in sort of the Mediterranean and Aegean region, the Strait of Scylla, actually seems to match the description. In other words, there's some craggy rocks there that if your ship got too close to them, you could run aground or, people could fall off or be snagged by the rocks. But the problem is if you tried to steer away from it, you would steer into a giant whirlpool. And that was, like Charybdis. So it was kind of like when people talk about being between Scylla and Charybdis or the devil in the deep blue sea, as it were, or between a rock and a hard place. Those are all metaphors for Scylla and Charybdis, and they become kind of psychological metaphors between, for being in a bad place. But literally, sailors would have had a very difficult time navigating that strait. I think, that was it. It was the Straits of Messina is what they originally were talking about them as being the sort of real-life site, if you will, of these outgrowths, or these natural formations that were so dangerous to sailors. But I remember reading that the Strait of Scylla actually does, in spite of the name, the name fits, but also the circumstances. So she turns men into pigs. She turns another nymph into a monster, supposedly out of jealousy. And what's interesting is the way in which all of these, represent, when we talk about fear of the feminine or what people are afraid of in terms of the feminine, she seems to be kind of a good archetypal model of that, if you will. I find myself, I had made a note to myself, I was comparing her enchantments of Kirke with those of the lotus eaters, the people who eat the enchanted flower. Now they don't turn into animals, but they kind of become forgetful. It's like they become stuck. I don't want to move from this place. There's that sense of a sort of unnatural peace, or that unnatural sense of still where something's not really right about it. Because life is not like that. Life, we have moments of stillness, and there are moments when we should be still. But it's about, ultimately life is about change and about movement. I mean, death is ultimately about change and movement and about things not being what they were. So things can't stay where they are, no matter how pleasant they may be at a particular point, or whatever the feeling is. Those feelings will come and go. They will go up and down like waves. And so in this case, I always kind of look at the very psychological nature of the Odyssey, and, how that can kind of almost represent the lotus eaters representing an impulse to sort of not want to grow up. And with Kirke, this is sort of the way in which men are sort of poorly equipped to deal with the feminine, as it were. And the way in which they kind of need this intervention to be able to negotiate it. And again, if we're looking at an archetypal level, when we look at the things that Odysseus does, it's almost like Jacob's struggle with the angel. It's it's struggling with that force that's within you. That could potentially, if it overpowers you, I mean, that can make you very weak. It can make you do stupid things for love. It can make you do, it can just make you completely, I think I compare it to the Lotus Eaters, because there is a sense of kind of wanting to just drop out. One whose total devotion might be to a particular woman or a particular person who fills that anima role, okay? And so I kind of... So I tend to look at that as, there's that. So again, I tend to associate that with the fear of emasculation, the idea that the man is not in control of the situation, that the woman is. Okay. Another interesting thing about Kirke is that when they come, she is singing and she is weaving on a giant loom. Now, one of the things that has been talked about, and I may have mentioned this in this podcast before. In fact, I'm almost certain I have. So I apologize if I'm being repetitive. But the notion of women's mythology, like the weaver as the, rather than the hero who battles his way and goes to the underworld and, cuts his way from the belly of the beast, which is a very, it's a very highly masculine kind of mythology that, my same dissertation supervisor had said to me, not just to me, but to my class, what would the woman's myth look like? And, we, like I said, you talk about Eros and Psyche, but this is the idea that, the woman who weaves. I believe April Shaley and I had this conversation in the Morrigan episode. That's where I'm remembering it from. But the woman who weaves, because the woman who weaves, in a way, she like I said, she's taking things, she almost has the role of one of the fates, because that's what the fates do. They spin the thread, they measure the length of your life, and then they cut the thread at the end. And what they're doing is they're weaving together the tapestry of life. So Kirke almost has this kind of underlying role, and it makes sense, because the feminine is also something we think of as that which generates life, whether it be an actual biological human life, or whether it be, in the sense of the muses, a creative idea, or an inspiration, or some other kind of thing that one could quote unquote give birth to and offer to the world. So she has all of these attributes of femininity. And the story emphasizes the ones that are a danger when the men focus too much on the sort of pleasurable aspects. Let's like as one account says that some people have turned it into kind of a story about a morality tale about getting drunk, which is not really what I think it's intended to be. But it is the idea of balancing that energy. I mean, you don't want feminine energy out of control any more than you want masculine energy out of control. So the fact that they kind of enact this little ritual between them, and then they come to an understanding, and then Kirke is actually able to help him. The reason he ultimately fails at what she tells him to do is not so much because of himself, but because of his men. Because they don't, she tells them, when you go to the island of the sun, the island of Helios, that's what they're like their last stop before they would get to Ithaca. She said, whatever you do, don't touch any of the cattle there. Don't eat them, don't kill them, don't, stay away from them. And, these are her father's cattle. But of course they're there and there's no wind and they're getting very hungry, and the men think, well, maybe if we just sacrifice one and do this. And then of course, because they violated the dictum, Helios complains to Zeus. Zeus destroys their ships. And so Odysseus is left simply clinging to, a board until he floats away to the island of Calypso, another nymph who also kind of serves an anima role. So it's like, one female leaves off and she advises him to a point, but then when he... So then he's put through this process. Really, in a way, that's kind of a rebirth process for Odysseus, because he ends up on this island with Calypso. He's stalled there for about 7 years. And then finally, Athena again comes with Hermaeus. Okay, same kind of structure, which is why sometimes the stories of Calypso and Kirke end up being confused, I think, in some later literature and some other literatures. And they tell Calypso, nope, he's got to go. So he builds himself a boat, and but Poseidon's still angry at him. So when Poseidon realizes he's left the island and is on the seas again, he sends a massive storm. And so the only thing that saves Odysseus is that there's a nymph, Ino, who gives him her veil. And if he holds on to her veil, he won't drown. So he ends up kind of being belched naked onto the shore. So here's a man who was a great warrior, who had everything, who fought for years, seasoned warrior, almost 20 years of fighting, attacking, looting, picking up concubine, all the stuff all the wonderful stuff that went along with warfare in those days. And he gets belched onto the shores of the island of Sherry, where he ends up meeting Nausicaa, the princess. She's probably like 12 years old, and she's doing her laundry. Not something you tend to think of with princesses. But there's definitely an element of, okay, your old life is dead, now you're being reborn again. And he's almost being reborn in a more feminine way. Tiresias tells him, you will go back to Ithaca and you will plant your ore. That implies something that's more domestic, which is why later accounts of him going back on the high seas don't really fit, at least if we're looking at that work in that way. But the idea is that he will become more domestic, that he will stay at home. He will not be this roving, restless warrior. He will be honoring more of the feminine side of himself. So, it's kind of like these figures that appear to make this, through whatever their trials are, whatever their manipulations and their tricks. In the end, if he successfully negotiates it, then he will come out to be a more whole person. Those who don't, they're turned to pigs. They go back to their baser instincts, which is not usually the better side of either masculinity or femininity. It's but on the other hand, it is sort of a part of things. You'll see in later literature, there's a lot of discussion about if Kirke lets Odysseus interview one of the pigs, and the pigs are kind of saying, well, this is actually kind of better than being a person, So there's a whole discussion about the about the sort of her turning people into animals, and what does that mean? Does that mean something negative? Is it merely exposing a certain part of our nature that we tend to dismiss or forget about? I think we tend to look at it in a very negative sense in a kind of culture, an ethical culture that says that, we should be taming our animalistic impulses, okay? And maybe you could take that away from this. I mean, I'm sure the men, you certainly don't get the impression that they were happy being turned into pigs. But it is kind of a caution about how when one gets involved with the anima, as Jung says, he describes it in an interview. There's a wonderful interview out there with Jung later in his life where he talks about the anima and the animus, and he says, I will have a man come to me and he is with the woman and he knows she is a hell of a business, that she's no good. And he will say to me, doctor, help me to get rid of this woman. He says, and Jung says, he can't. He's like clay in her fingers. And he says, and that is the archetype. It's not until the projection is withdrawn. Whatever that strong anima image, whatever that strong, very powerful feminine, whatever this image is, again, you can't possibly define it in any kind of concrete terms. It's just something in each individual, they kind of know it when they see it for themselves. And it doesn't always have to do with a particular look or even a particular personality trait. It's just, there's just something. Because you will fall for somebody, and then it's like, it does not matter how the relation. This is why people stay in bad relationships, or we'll say because they are just so drawn in, they're almost powerless to do anything. Because the pain of separating is so great. So this is the, and if you're a man in that situation, feeling that way about a woman, then people kind of act like, oh, well, she's got him wrapped around her finger, right? I mean, not that couldn't go either way, but it's just, it seems it's more acceptable for a woman to be needing a man, right? But it's not except the other way around. It's just kind of like, oh, well, that's emasculating. And that is the interpretation there. So it's very interesting. But it's, there seems to be almost this counterbalancing of this masculine against the devouring feminine, kind of like, I think of Tiamat and Marduk, you're the great Mother Earth that actually becomes the firmament of the earth is cut into pieces by Marduk, because now she's the mother of everything that threatens to devour everything. And you have this sort of, and over time, just like we saw with the Erinyes or the Furies, and with some of these other figures, over time they go from being goddesses in their own right that represent a complex group of feminine aspects or traits, some of which are dangerous, some of which are pleasant, and we tend to see an emphasis on the negative side of that as some, negative thing to be avoided. Not surprising when you start to see Roman influence come in, and especially since Romans were influenced by the philosophers and also by Judaic thinking, because certainly in Proverbs you have the idea of beware of the foreign woman who will drag you down to Sheol, who will bring you to your death through her foreign temptations. And it's funny, they do use, at least in some versions of it, they do use the word foreign. Sometimes they use the word loose. And I'm like, oh, okay, that's an interesting, why does, one translates it as loose and one is foreign. In short, it's referring to it as something that's other, okay? And we can see why there's this unconscious mythology of the man who, maybe gets involved with a woman that he shouldn't, maybe somebody who's underage or somebody, and they'll say, well, or what was she wearing? Or what was she doing? And we call people out for that now. We're like, hey, you know what? She can wear whatever she wants. But there are people who will try to say, well, if she's so concerned about men looking at her, but look at how she dresses. I heard that the other day. Not about me, but and I kind of turned around and said, excuse me? It's not, it becomes this, it becomes a way of blaming the woman because the woman is mistaken for the anima. She's perceived as having this dangerous quality. Okay. And it's important to remember that because you need to be able to separate the average living female from the anima. When you see the anima in the woman, that's because you're projecting it onto her, not because she necessarily is all of that. And frequently it's an image, it is an image that no woman could ever live up to, just like the animus in its best form is not something a man could ever live up to. You have to be able to separate from the archetype and if you still care about the person, then what you have is actual love, okay? Oftentimes that projection is just a gateway because when you fall in love with somebody, you think, oh, they're just perfect, everything about them is perfect. And then, as you get to know them and the projection is withdrawn, the reality sets in, then you start to see all of their imperfections. And God forbid you get married, because then it's like, then you really see it. Or you live together and you really start to see it. And so it can change. And I've often said that when people get married, it doesn't always have to happen, but unfortunately it frequently does, where the wife, once somebody is no longer the girlfriend or the whatever, and that person becomes the spouse, and I'm going to say the wife in particular in this case, wife then becomes mama. And the expectation is that, oh, okay, we're husband and wife now, so now I'm going to role play what mom and dad did, when I was growing up, and and whatever that is for you, that's kind of your expectation of your spouse, that your spouse is going to do what your mother did, and your female spouse, if assuming heterosexual relationship, man woman, that does tend to become the assumption, and the thing is, it's very unconscious. And it can happen overnight. I could tell you stories from my own life. I can tell you stories from other people's lives. And it just, overnight, there's, you've changed from being one type of feminine to being another. You've changed from being, and the mother, because there has been a separation from the mother as one grows up and develops, there's more of a disdain for that. It's more just kind of like, the person is almost considered to have a more subservient kind of a role, if that's what they're used to. Okay. So again, so these are all things that if you find them playing out in your life and in your relationships, you really want to pay attention. Are you allowing yourself to be unconsciously driven by the archetype? Because that's the way that we actually can use rationality as a tool to stop and go, hey, wait a minute. I don't have to repeat that pattern. I don't have to accept that viewpoint. And I accept that I'm having these particular feelings or that this archetype is affecting me in this way. But I don't necessarily have to, my actions don't necessarily just have to go along with that. I can try to balance it. Doesn't mean you can get rid of it. You cannot eradicate it. You cannot stamp it out. And, the more you try to repress it, the more it's going to have a hold on you. But by acknowledging that, yeah, you know what, I feel this way, at some point I won't feel this way. And you just kind of weather your way through it. And yes, there is a kind of suffering attached, especially if the person doesn't reciprocate, or especially if it doesn't, it's not all that it's cracked up to be. And that's one of the things about love, you take the risk for the ecstasy of it, and it can be a brutal disappointment. So you just kind of have to recognize that that's just part of the process, and that some of this is just the way that the archetype injects itself as you go through life. Okay. And Kirke, I feel, is a representation of that. Yeah, and I have notes here too, as time goes on, as I was starting to say about how we see that the way the Furies go from being goddesses to being kind of these evil tormentors. Similarly, you have Kirke, who is a daughter of the sun goddess. She's got the fire and water in her, actually. She's actually almost like the temperance figure in a way, one foot in the water and one, on the earth. And which also makes her liminal in a way too. She's kind of on both sides of things, and she has these powers, and she knows the ways of the earth. She's definitely a nature goddess. The way that she becomes a witch, and of course witch ends up having a very negative connotation later on, because anyone who has this kind of magical knowledge is considered to be that's considered to be, against God's law or whatever it is. There's definitely a sense that those who have a knowledge of things of the earth are somehow, wicked or associated with the devil or untrustworthy or evil, or, it becomes aligned with a definitive negative. And so therefore she becomes this sorceress who was going around doing horrible things to men until Odysseus put her in her place. That's what it becomes after a while. And she becomes a representation of the scheming, conniving woman. So it's interesting, so again, we see how these ideas of the feminine in a society that has implied rationality, that has applied ethics to its religion, that has talked about a dichotomy between good and evil, how this ends up, being put through the meat grinder of that and coming out on the other side as something not originally what it was. And that does not get the full richness of the archetype or the figure, which again, like Anima, like Ereshkigal, like a lot of these other goddesses, ultimately she's not really either good or evil. She's sort of a natural force, and she represents something that can be like a lot of trickster forces or liminal forces. They can be dangerous and they can be helpful. It all depends. It's just a matter of those are the places where you want to use your rationality and your wit, okay? To stay on balance so that you don't get thrown off balance. But if you do get thrown off balance, do understand that may be part of the process too. So with that, I just want to say, I think I'll try to keep this concise this week. I'm going to be, this is for mid-November, so probably our next episode is going to be talking about the Black Madonna or the Black Virgin and some of her manifestations. I'll be talking with Ellen Jones, who also goes by the Spiral Priestess, who developed the wonderful Dark Mother's deck that I like to use sometimes in our, when I do my patron videos. So she and I will be having this conversation. That should be our next episode. And again, as I've said to patrons, I've gotten a couple suggestions for episodes, so thanks to my patrons for providing those. But certainly if there are any others, do let me know. I'm on Facebook, I'm on Twitter, I'm on Instagram, and I'm all, under, Chthonia, either Chthonia Podcast on Facebook and on Twitter and on Instagram. I'm Chthonia Podcast. And in one word, I think, on Twitter, 2 words on Facebook, and 1 word on Instagram. And then, of course, on YouTube, it's just Chthonia. So, and I've had a bunch of new subscribers lately. Thank you so much. My, stats on this are going up, and I'm really happy. And also, if you want to join Patreon, if you're interested in supporting this work, and aside from the podcast, I'm also looking to offer more classes. I have some published works. I'm working on some new stuff. I have the Chthonia.net website. It needs a little bit of updating to make it a little less. I think some aspects of it are a little clunky, but I've got to get a plan in place to get all that straightened out by the beginning of next year. But nonetheless, it's still very navigable. So please take a look. And and if you're interested in these projects, patreon.com/Chthonia. You can, if you want to donate towards this work, I would be extremely grateful. I say thank you to all my existing patrons, and we will talk in the next episode.